A few months back, I had the pleasure of sitting in on an online lecture about the 151st Infantry Regiment of the French Army during the Battle of Verdun. And in building up to that battle, the speaker, Mr. Jonathan Bracken, who is the author of a book called The Verdun Regiment, provided us with a brief history of the regiment's actions up to that point. And as he was moving through these numerous battles, providing us with quotations and statistics along the way, a very disturbing trend very rapidly became apparent. The immensely, even unbelievably high casualty numbers. Now, I don't remember the exact figures for exact battles, so this is all approximations. But I do remember some of those numbers were as high as being like around 50%, one half, seemingly, of an entire regiment being made a casualty in a single battle. It's mind-boggling, but that's the least of it. Some of the numbers went up as high as 75%. 85%, 95%, battle after battle. The numbers only seem to be getting higher and all the more impossible until eventually the last slide had an altogether not very short list of battles with 100% casualties and even higher. If I remember right, I think that the highest number he had was something around like 114%. It may have even been higher than that. Now, if 50% was mind-bogglingly terrible, nearly impossible to comprehend, well, a full 100%? Surely that must be impossible. I mean, literally every last man, from the lowest private to the commanding officer, all of them being made a casualty in one battle alone? I mean, surely after they suffer, I don't know, half of their strength taken out, they'd maybe try to pull the regiment out a little bit before they get utterly annihilated? Or what? Is there going to be a time when the higher-ups would order the 151st saying, all right, lads, you're going to go up and hold this section of the trench against an enemy charge, or you're gonna move up that hill and take it from the enemy, and then they turn around to the regiment and there's literally just like three guys and a dog sitting there all muddied, sort of wearily saluting and saying, "Oui, General." Or perhaps even worse, how on earth are you going to explain away more than 100% casualties? I mean, what, did they start digging up old bodies and throwing them into the trenches before they got hit again and then declared a casualty a second time? Like, oh, well, that corpse wasn't in a good way before, but now he's definitely not going to fight anymore. And what, an entire army of Pope Formosises, as it were? Well, no. No, of course not. I mean, yes, these casualty ratios are extreme, and they do betray just how brutal and horrific the fighting of the First World War was, particularly when compared to earlier conflicts. But all the same, these rates of over 100% and whatnot are not quite so impossible as they may first seem. A 100% casualty ratio does not necessarily mean that the regiment itself was actually reduced to a zero fighting strength. So, a quick note that the word casualty, some of us may not be aware, it doesn't necessarily mean death. Rather, a soldier becomes a casualty when they are taken out of the fight for most any reason. Now, yes, naturally, a man who is killed in action will be counted as a casualty in the figures because, well, he can't exactly fight if he is going to be 6 feet under the ground. But also, any man who is wounded sufficiently to send him to the rear out of the fight for any significant amount of time will also be marked down as a casualty. It could be anything from a fractured limb to a lost limb. It could be something that takes a soldier out of the fight permanently or only temporarily. Same thing with sickness. It could be a man gets a bad case of dysentery and is sent to hospital for a time. He will become a sick casualty. Or it could very well be that a man goes blind and he's out of the fight permanently. He's still a casualty. He's out of the fight. Even a man who is captured by the enemy will be marked down in that way, because if he's captured, he can't fight for us anymore. He is a casualty. If a soldier is able to be treated of his wounds in the field and then return to action just after the fact, rather than being taken out of the action and officially marked down as such, he will not be classified as a casualty. And naturally, of course, what's the best way for a man to avoid becoming a casualty? Well, it is readily accessible, high-quality first aid equipment. That's right, everyone, it's time for the video's advertisement, and that is my segue. I am delighted to say that this video is brought to you and sponsored by Dutch TMC. They are a company that sells a wide variety of first aid supplies, and particularly their new Warrior box. It's a kind of military-grade first aid kit, if you will, with an awful lot more to offer you than that $10 CVS kit that we all keep in our cars with 2 Band-Aids and a cotton ball. There are countless numbers of other, survivalist boxes online and whatnot, but a lot of them, it seems, are just sort of filled with testosterone-fueled fluff, designed to really make you feel tough, but without actually making you prepared for a potential emergency situation. Now, Dutch TMC's owner, whom I had the pleasure of speaking with, is an actual veteran of 10 years with the Dutch military as a combat nurse, and he has designed the Warrior Box to actually have that substance, that standard, which a proper survivalist kit ought to have. Every item within the box has been carefully selected among the best products on the market, at least available to him, all from renowned medical companies across the world. Nothing cheap or nothing throwaway just to improve their margin. If we cut down the quality of the bandages, we can make 0.5 more cents per box, and none of that nonsense, I've been assured. Dutch TMC is after quality, experienced military-grade quality. Now, of course, I cannot guarantee that if you found yourself in the battlefield of Verdun, that a first aid kit, even the Warrior Box, would really save your life. You'd probably want a full-on military hospital with medics and all that sort of thing for those sorts of injuries. But say you're out on a hike or some such. You're conquering a mountain range rather than vast swaths of France, and something happens to you or someone that you're with, then it's definitely something that's worth considering, I think, having in your pack. Dutch TMC is accepting orders now for their Warrior Box, so visit their website today using the link I have provided down below. Thank you to Dutch TMC for sponsoring this video, and now back to business. Now, I mentioned the definition of the word casualty because that is at least where part of the secret to our more than 100% casualty rates lie. Now, say a man goes to fight in the Battle of Verdun. He doesn't have his Warrior Box with him, and he receives a somewhat nasty, though certainly not lethal, wound. Now, he and all of the other men who are taken out of the regiment's service that day, for whatever reason, death, injury, or otherwise, are all marked down for the regiment's purposes, combat purposes, as a casualty. Then, say, after a few days in hospital, that same man is recovered and sent back out to the front, where he again suffers some rather unfortunate fate and is again sent away from the front as a casualty. It's a funny play in the statistics, if you will, but now, for that one soldier, we have had 2 instances of casualties within the regiment. Now, have that happen to a significant number of the men, and it becomes pretty easy to see how you can get such an extremely high casualty ratio, such as 50%, 75%, or even, again, over 100%, particularly in battles like Verdun, where you could expect to take casualties just trying to get to the battle, let alone actually fighting on the front itself. Now, another very significant figure to keep in mind here is that military organizational figures are hardly ever going to be a single static number that is fixed in time and space. They don't drum up the initial force, send them out to fight, and then watch them slowly get whittled down to nothing. They receive men from the reserves. They receive replacements, reinforcements to fill their lost spaces. So let's have an example, and please don't expect these numbers to be realistic in any way. I'm only making them overly simplistic for the sake of argument and demonstration purposes. I do not know anything at all about how French regiments were organized during the First World War, how large battalions would have been, things like that. But let's say that you have an initial battalion of 1,000 men. That is their paper strength, their on-paper strength. They march out to battle, and after some time, they suffer in the battle 300 casualties, bringing their total down to 700 strong. Now, the war has many demands, but the army is thankfully able to drum up for them 150 new recruits and replacements to send to the regiment, bringing their new total strength up to 850. Then let's say of those initial 300 casualties, a further 50 are able to recover sufficiently from their wounds to return to the front, and so now we are up to a total of 900 men. Okay, so at the end of this very simple battle, we have a strength of 900 soldiers out of an initial 1,000. So, does this mean that they suffered 10% casualties? What if that battalion actually had a full 250 new recruits on top of the 50 recovered, and they were still at 1,000 strength by the end of it all? Did they walk away from the battle with a 0% casualty rate, despite 250 men losing life or limb? Well, no, obviously not, to both of those cases. And similarly, if this battalion had, say through the course of its life in this battle, a total of 1,150 men serve in it at any given time, do we report that number, 1,150, as the total strength during the battle? Well, maybe not. It all depends on whether we're marking down the total strength or the effective strength of the battalion at any particular time. There may have been over 1,000 men in the battalion during the entirety of the period, but at no time during the battle, no individual time, was its strength over 1,000 people. It's what leads to another little bit of fun military statistics. For example, if you look at the total strength column for World War I on Wikipedia, it'll say that the British and French armies each had nearly 9 million men in them. But the actual maximum strength at any given time of those armies was significantly lower than 9 million. So depending on how we report these different statistics, as well as how historians after the fact might interpret them, whether those interpretations are flawed or simply one-directional, so to say, well, we could very well have a battalion with a total strength of 1,150, which suffered 300 casualties at 26%. Or alternatively, we could have the same battalion with a maximum strength, or an initial strength, of 1,000 suffer 300 casualties, making it 30%. Now, with this particular example, these figures are still pretty easy to figure out overall. You'd probably go with the latter example because of the 1,000 men who went into that first battle, 30% of them became casualties. The 150 who came in later on weren't necessarily present for that engagement, so it might not make sense to include them in the total figures. If, 1,000 men go out over the top, 300 of them become casualties, it becomes dishonest to say only 26% of them were casualties because more men came in after the fact. But again, depending on how thorough you are getting into those numbers, you can see how it might be reported either way. But in the Great War, as you might expect, things are rarely, if ever, this simple. One of the biggest shifts which we see in military history during the early 20th century is that having a battle no longer means just having two or a few armies roaming around the countryside in these large solid blocks, trying to outmaneuver the other like on a great big chessboard, before all coming together in one central point and fighting it out over the course of one or a couple of days. Rather, we see entire front lines, entire national borders being fully militarized, fully occupied by soldiers, with pushes and offensives being made at particular points along those broader lines. In those earlier instances of the 18th or 19th centuries, those sorts of figures were a lot more straightforward. You have comparatively pretty set army sizes for the duration of the battles. It's not as common, at least, to see, massive numbers of recruits or replacements flooding in to support individual battalions during a long, month-long engagement or some such. And as well, the geographical and the temporal boundaries of the battle were, again, at least when compared to, say, the Great War, pretty solidly set and determined. When was the Battle of Waterloo fought? 18th of June, 1815. Where was it fought? At the field of Waterloo, a more or less single field. When was the Battle of Verdun fought? The 21st of February to 18th of December, 1916. 9 months. I believe that I'm pulling from a Winston Churchill quote when I say that this, in a more traditional sense, it's not a battle so much as it is a siege. It's an entire campaign. During those 9 months, a regiment isn't just going to be involved in a single action, a single charge, a single push. They're going to be involved in dozens, hundreds even, of actions which could all very easily be described as full-on battles themselves. They're going to suffer immense casualties. They're going to receive replacements and recruits who in turn will again suffer casualties. They will move to the front, away from the front, and back again. But by the end of it all, if you want to be able to flash a single figure so we can tell people what the casualty ratio was for a particular regiment during the entirety of that battle, well, you're going to have to make some decisions on how we are reporting the mathematics. For the 18th century, it's easy. The battalion went into the battle in the morning with 250 men, and by the battle's end in the afternoon, they were reduced to 200 strong. Okay, cool. 200 divided by 250, casualty ratio of 20%. Easy and clean. For Verdun, the Somme? Well, all right, the regiment went into battle with 2,000 men before suffering 15% casualties in the first week's fighting. They were resupplied on the 9th day before being redeployed, suffering 2% casualties in the process. Then took part in a major offensive, resulting in 34% casualties, again resupplied before fending off a major contest. So on, so forth, for 9 months. Dear Lord, the statistics of the First World War, I can only describe them as almost, if not entirely, incomprehensible in their scale. So in all of these ways, you can see how it is in fact entirely possible, grimly so, to calculate a casualty ratio of well over 100%, and to have it be a genuine figure with no mistakes being made at all in the process of coming to it. It doesn't mean that literally every single man was made a casualty. Indeed, it's entirely possible to have a regiment suffer such, but still have individuals within it walk away from the war physically at least unscathed. But even still, the very fact that we are even able to have this conversation, that it even is vaguely possible to conceive of, to have battles that lasted for months, to have casualty ratios which even approach 50%, no matter how you measure them, it all speaks to the titanic and the brutal nature of the First World War. I'm so glad that I was able to sit in on Mr. Bracken's lecture that day, because alongside the fascinating and the tragic accounts that he shared with us of individual soldiers from that famed Verdun regiment, it was just by flashing up those simple statistics, brief things, nowhere near the focus of his lecture, it was just a quick talking point that he really opened my eyes up to an entirely new way of thinking, of conceiving about that war. And if you're interested in reading more on the Verdun Regiment and reading Mr. Bracken's book, I'll include a link in the description down below so you can see that as well. And I'll also be sure to link some brilliant statistical information on the recreated 151st's website down below. They're an American-based World War I reenactment group. So thank you all so very much for watching, and of course most particularly today to the video sponsor, Dutch TMC. Again, click that link in the description down below to learn more about the Warrior Box and be prepared for whatever may come your way in future, whether you're on a car trip or a hiking trip or in the fields of Verdun. Probably not the fields of Verdun. Don't go into battle, and maybe trust the actual army people. You get the idea. Civilian uses, medical grade equipment for civilian uses and all that, so check it out. Of course, as well, thank you to my supporters on patreon.com, for it is by virtue of your continuous and ever generous support that I am able to carry on with my work. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.